Hello everyone. So today I was thinking about this because I was a bit lazy enough with my existential crises, anxiety issues and so on. And normally I come, to this daily moment of the video making to vent a little bit. And so I had something in port, let's say, prepared, but then I said, oh, yeah, who cares? Let's talk about this every once in a while. I used to make before, I think we should recover at some point the Clausewitzian series because that helped to break a little bit for me to actually make better videos, right? Rather than all these one in a row. Recently, I've resorted mostly to manualistic topics so that it was easier for me to prepare like a new historical topic in a row. But then there is also space to this other, interludium and also other considerations that we may not be interested in relatively to historical knowledge in general that I used to make a bit more often in the past. So there's this historian playlist, so-called, where I basically discuss all these broader theoretical issues that may emerge, or mostly about, philosophy of history, if you can argue, or something, maybe even more scientific, properly in nature. But I was wondering, given that exactly I've come recently from these manuals, and actually realizing the usefulness of the same, right? And especially the differences that the difference can be made depending on the various manuals and kind of what people can put in it or not. You see, it's extremely easy because I can use these manuals like there is 1 or 2 pages, and I can make a video for 1 hour and a half because everything that I managed to think about that, right? I simply speak about and frame it in a broader question. It can be interesting, right? And I noticed that at least originally these also more general topics videos were kind of more successful, maybe than others, more selective. Was not always, frankly. It depends really on the topic. That the audience is somewhat biased on average regarding this or that topic. Sometimes, you know what I think about that. I don't know. I don't even know how to correctly pose myself in front of this, because from one side it's maybe frustrating to see that that there is just a selective interest. From the other side, well, it's better that if there is any interest in the first place. So today I thought to talk about this because I was looking at my stats and I noticed that there are lots of young people at the same time. The most audience mostly my age, and so then, however, it's followed just by the younger chunk, from 18 to 24. And the obvious implication is also, even if on YouTube you can't really indicate that there are lots of younger people, right? So that's an age group that eventually is either in high school or maybe studying even history, or maybe wondering, or in their early 20s what to do, how can I learn history. Sometimes I get these questions like how to pursue a scrupulous historical knowledge, I even answered, like, I think it was the last question and answer video that I made about that. And so I think getting to the basics, sometimes it's also beautiful to live a bit in the past, to think how you started and how important thing was for you, so that can even be helpful for others. This is not what I'm going to talk about today. Actually, it's more a general consideration on manuals, right? Because manuals are, right, it's about manuals and how to learn kind of the basics, in this case of medieval history, given that that's mostly what we talk about, and because I'm a medievalist and all the things that and so this is the preferred topic in a sense. We could also comment on other subjects, frankly, because that's also interesting. But this is the one that it can help the most. Learning medieval history is objectively not easy, right? As far as I've seen, especially now you get in assistantship, you see, you witness examinations and you pose questions yourself to the students. You say, you realize that, this can vary from place to place, but let's be honest about it. In general, that kids do not get basically any historical education from school, or arguably none whatsoever at some level, especially the historical one, because history is treated like a sort of B-series subject. The reason being, it's not really, you can't really apply it, positively. It's mostly theory or even abstraction or something like that, but obviously not the case. But it's indeed true that history should be known well, to, like any subject, to be fruitful in some ways. And as you know, I think that history in particular is particularly fruitful, arguably maybe the most fruitful subject, scientifically speaking, for reasons I am not going to repeat, given that we talk about them rather too often. And so it's obvious that from school you don't actually get what you need about that, and history in general. Like in school, normally you learn stories, narratives, also at some points, even always less, but even though they're very important, names and dates, because without those you really can't properly have a historical knowledge. And that's the other myth among the many others that we have been fed, is that history should not be taught with dates and names because they're boring, they're meaningless, it's about the broader concepts. Yes, but if you don't kind of even know who are the protagonists, or where the freaking thing happened, or when, it's a bit difficult even to understand any kind of historical implication, right? So it's not just been pointing abstractly at a historical event in a vacuum and pretending that by itself has any meaning. If it's decontextualized from, in fact, the same historical contingency. So I really don't understand that argument, and it's not that I understand it, it's just a stupid argument, Frank. And secondly, you tend to, you're probably not given the opportunity, first of all, to make research properly meant, which is kind of obvious. You can't really teach high school kids to make a real, you can write a little essay, a thesis, things like these. You can make a research on the internet, or libraries, even still, people visit these places consistently. But in high school you have lots of other subjects. It's a bit complex, but that's not the point. The point is, the most profitable thing be, since high school, to teach history in ways that really expose students to the complexity of the same, which is what you can't properly demand from most school teachers in the first place. And they tend to make it simple because the kids are already bored, and teachers are normally ignorant, and so that's not a great combination. So as always, it's a matter of motivation, and teachers come now from the same mechanism here that when they were school students. So it seems like a hopeless circle that closes itself. So for high school, just think about maybe doing your best really in every subject, because that's really the only time in your life that you're provided with the opportunity of creating such a large scale of interest. And so even history, yes, you can argue it's not maybe so fundamental as it seems, but the problem is when there should be there are school programs with some standards, with some information, more or less statewide, or at least depending on the educational system. And when you go at university, you realize that by examining these kids that they have just arrived, that fundamentally they haven't learned anything about those standards, right? Not even about the basis, right? Properly not having an idea broadly meant of what the whole thing is. again, there are many reasons we don't live in a perfect world, but at that point, of course, you also have, when do you want to make them learn? I personally witnessed, even in the first years of university, when there are these basic history exams that professors let go because they don't want to have too many students representing, so it's also kind of a vicious system in that way, at the detriment of the quality of teaching and examinations and discipline and profit, let's call it profit, from an individual perspective of the student. And yes, there are also people who are not really there just because they will study history. Maybe they study other humanistic subjects most of the time. So that may be a thing, but it's still, considering what could be done just by tightening a little bit the criteria of evaluation, being a bit harsher. You could easily have people with a much, sounder historical education. Because again, it's not about much the quantity of what you learn, but the quality of the effort that you make to learn, to memorize, to understand the implications. And once you have reached that depth of thinking, you can apply it to any other information that you come across. So that's what normally education is designed to do, right? It's not even about the content, it's about the structure, right? But contents are important too, because knowing how to handle many of them dramatically amplifies this capacity. So manuals, I have a discrete, maybe in my country I've read many medieval history manuals for the sake of, in part also for Schwerpunkt, but not only, because I was just curious. There were some manuals that are, they're very different, let's say, in nature. Today, I think, in the West, generally speaking, there is this sense of, standardization of a certain form of certain chapters, like, you have the early Middle Age. It's kind of obvious, it couldn't be otherwise. There's the migration, the late Roman Empire, then the migration era, and then there's this other phenomena, maybe at an economical level, during, even also Carolingian, post-Carolingian times. You have the chapter on the Byzantines every once in a while, normally 3, depending on the various ages. So you get across these kind of chunks of, there are thematic chunks more than else that are somewhat standardized. At this point, like, you understand when you read these manuals, also knowing the authors sometimes and how they work and what's their expertise, that it doesn't really take much to write a manual. Like, I could easily write a medieval history manual. Right, it would take a while, but it would still be very easy, because the information you can grasp even just from reliable sources, digitalized ones on the internet and so on, is good enough to make a point that you can simply say, okay, well, maybe there is else to say, or I could say this better, or maybe this is still just a part of it, even if it's well said. But let's say this is what a student should know, and manuals vary wildly in the nature of the content. You would be surprised about that. There are manuals that are sometimes properly biased. I've seen, of course, depending on different countries, that have had the opportunity of seeing that there is a dramatic shift in, let's say, the center of gravity, Tolkien and Schwerpunkt, let's say, in mostly geographically speaking. It's obvious that every country tends to focus mostly on its own history, but one thing is, let's say, normally having like a thicker chapter on your own country than framed among lots of other things that are well balanced out. Sometimes it is a matter of like mixing a bit too much of everything, right? Try to make that aforementioned kind of mostly ideal history, or something, say, not ideal in the idealistic sense, or in the sense of the importance of ideas that I'm a great proponent of, against a mere materialistic interpretation of history. But let's say a conceptual one, in fact, let's say better, that not only mixes a bit all in, but also in this sense dilutes certain topics to the detriment of others, and shifts the attention mostly towards a certain point or another in history, which I don't think it's very, like, you see, as a proponent of anti-morally relativistic stances, I I think that there is a reality to study, and there is let's say, a truth that cannot quite be seen completely, but that you can't come closer and closer the better you study reality. And so, let's say if a manual concentrates too much on I don't know, a certain geographical area in general, right? I'm not even talking about a specific country, but let's say it could be northern, eastern, western, southern, things like these, and another does something different in that sense. Well, the question is, intrinsically, one of these two manuals is worse or better than the other, right? There is no way around, because history is all like what happened historically is only one, right? There is no way to change that. There is just a way of telling the story. And so many problems that we also point out on Schwerpunkt regarding to this often occur, because this bias is objectively, it's not even a bias, right? The idea of bias is it's an unfair judgment, right? And fairness can, in that sense, come also from the how proportionally you kind of tell the story. You may extend the whole thing to, I don't know, the world history. Like, it's obvious that in Western manuals, I never read anything it was, I don't know, from other country, from other continents. But I mean, at least considering the West on those multiple continents. But I don't know what they study in Asian countries or in African countries. I don't know. I have no idea. And it's obvious though that a Western manual, especially if you talk about the Middle Ages, is always mostly going to be Europe. Yes, there is an attention towards mostly the Mediterranean, broadly meant. I mean, it's also the Near East, North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond, because maybe a word about China or India or something. It's not to be given for granted most of the time, but it's still, however, reduced to something very inconsistent. And so even Schwerpunkt suffers of this, but at that point you also have to consider other issues that are in part the fact that it's not just that there is a cultural distance broadly meant. Even just think about in language, who does know Mandarin Chinese at this point in the West? I mean, there are people, but how many of them are there, and how many are they enough to contribute significantly in terms of historiographical debate, right, between different countries? And so also Europe is not really China in terms of how we think or study or understand history in the first place. And it's obvious that if Europeans maybe are more concentrated on European history, is also because other people in their own country didn't make a great job at even studying their own history or researching their own history for all problems that you can easily understand. In any case, there is also a broader problem of bias at that point. But let's say taking a Western standard as good, which normally is, still there are wild variations within that range, in fact, of interest. And so that is quite risky, because you understand where certain prejudices and misunderstandings actually come from. Still today, historically speaking, considering certain areas are kind of less relevant when they were not less relevant. As a matter of fact, they were the most relevant. But since you teach kids from a country that maybe is from the other side of Europe, still yes, you can tell maybe the history of that specific country to them better, but still not obscuring overall this broader continental perspective, because it's at that point, how can they even understand the importance of their own national history if they don't know the history of Europe, what broadly meant? You can't measure that. It's impossible, culturally speaking. So it's interesting, and different manuals are also different in maybe even in age, right? Who wrote them when? I come from a country that has a discrete classicistic, which is not necessarily a positive thing, legacy, which means that basically we venerate a bit too much the oldies, right, in general, and which is not bad, which is not even it's a matter of notionism, etc. But let's say for the kid, the aforementioned kid from school, where he didn't learn anything about history, that's not maybe maybe the best way to study these things, because there is a manual, for example, that I love, that is the one that I say that in theory I should have prepared the first medieval history exam back in the day. That was a terrible manual for that first impact with history, because it was a too beautiful one, right? It was a too developed, a too detailed, a too rich, a too insightful, a too intelligent one, right? For somebody who just started at the time. So I actually prepared that exam on all these kind of, compendiums of history, condensated dates, names, places, but effectively, for this exam, I got the highest mark, and also because I had heavily, integrated those notions with other things that I searched at that point, even on the internet. It's not a big deal, but I still remember things from that exam, for example, that I, as opposed to other things that I learned along the way at university, because I really made an effort to learn that stuff, and it was quite interesting. Some things that I thought at the time, just as a novice, it turned out to be very concretely and very objectively, received well at the time, as opposed to maybe other ideas that I developed more along the way, that, however, maybe a bit more speculative in nature, I had to adjust a little bit. But getting, in fact, a sound understanding of basic medieval history is somewhat necessary for any kind of expertise that you can have. I mean, I don't know where you're going to boast your historical knowledge, or what kind of use you make of the same. It's difficult even for me to understand why you follow, for example, my medieval history content, or my content in general for that matter. Let's say, yes, sure, of course I integrate with things that are sometimes also advanced, that I make some interesting points, but I presume that it's not even about medieval history, is it? I mean, it's just about me telling stuff, right? That is kind of interesting to you. But what you get from me is indeed, a view that I developed over time. Even if you look at the same Schwerpunkt history chronology, you see that the first videos were really, so aside from me speaking wars and all this stuff, but let's say my understanding of history was definitely less advanced than now. It's kind of obvious. Schwerpunkt, as I often said, contributed dramatically to the quality of that information. So what I discovered through the same Schwerpunkt is that, first of all, exactly because of this reason, you realize that even if I had studied the things at the time, it took talking about them, right? Speaking my mind about them, articulating certain concepts, trying to explain, broadly speaking, the whole thing, to increase my capacity, even to my knowledge, even just of medieval history. I see this all the time because, even when I talk to some PhD and colleague, or even professors, because at the end of the day, that's the end of, you just get to discover I think it's interesting. What are the limits of a professor's knowledge? And I tell you that, they're very, very narrow sometimes. And you realize that they literally skip the basis. The basics. I mean, you would expect a professor knows, like, of a manual medieval history, the one that 18, 19-year-old kids have to prepare their exam the first year, kind of know everything of, right? It's absolutely not the case. But it's not the case in the sense that they even think that they should know all of that. And I think it's bad, because sometimes you have some historical discussions with them, and you figure out that you can't make a historical point, because it's as if you were talking to your parents. At least my parents didn't study history at university, but let's say even more, because my parents even do know certain historical things that some of my professors don't. And the reason being that they learn other stuff. uh, in different ways, and still sometimes with even a broader kind of and the reason it's kind of, you can't really criticize the system altogether all the time, but I believe that still it's somewhat serious that such a thing happens, that even though you're overloaded as a professor in your career with this need of publishing and publishing and publishing, because you're literally forced to do it, and it's not good, right? And so you don't have time literally for anything else, and you kind of forget things, right? Still, getting the basics right would be a good thing. I always remember my tutor says, I don't know, we were talking about Byzantine emperors, and she said, there was a time in which I knew them all by heart, and already at the time, I can say now, I don't remember. I could say the same thing. I did, because for my Byzantine history exam, I did learn them all by heart, but let's say now I forget. But still, I know lots of other interesting things about the whole thing that I didn't know about Byzantine history before. But the idea of getting the basics right, especially anagraphically for kids, like especially before 24, 25, when they're, when your brain is still still very fresh, right? It still can absorb and retain information on a very consistent base. It's really what, in fact, most of your historical understanding will be based upon later on. This is often overlooked, right? And so you understand that given that university exams today are, you can't even say in absolute terms they're bad exams, but let's say it's not that you're literally learning by heart all these things, especially the very first exams you make on this topic. Chances are that you'll always remain with this, you will study most people would just study a little bit, try just to pass the exam. They don't give a damn about not even the mark, but properly about even knowing about anything about that subject. And so these people will go on, and maybe they will become, strangely enough, maybe experts in some other thing, but still, if you ask them, even in a humanistic field, something about medieval history, wouldn't even know what you were talking about. This happens to historians in the same way. It's one of the most interesting things that can occur to you as a historian, is confronting yourself with other historians from other eras, right? From, historiographically, with antiquists, with modernists, with contemporaneous. It's very funny because you realize how distant historians are actually from one another, what kind of different figures they can come to be as individuals, right? And all with a certain, bias that is ferocious sometimes. For example, you would be surprised to know that it's much easier to, for a medievalist and a contemporaneist to get along than for a medievalist and a modernist or an antiquist, because we border, and so of course we kill each other in the process, as always. And it's not also that we like, as medievalists, we like contemporaneous. We just pity them because we don't even think they are historians actually. But at least in that sense, that there is we know that we can't really harm each other because we are so distant in a way that it becomes more a matter of philosophy than and mood and character and personality than actual science and profession. But that is quite eloquent, because as you understand, as we were making before the point of geography, well, that can happen also, from a country to another, from a culture to another, to a view to another, from a view to another. I would like to stress the risks also of your preconceptions sometimes. It's obvious that younger people are kind of more ideologically extremistic. They are mostly iconoclastic in nature. They still have, in fact, to destroy what they have learned up to that point and to reform it in a way that is eventually the one they're going to use to sort out the world eventually. And so there are people who have pretty bad bias in that sense. Politically speaking, there are just certain too many problems in the way we think history. Some people see even university as a place where you should make activism. One day I will talk about that, because I don't think that I saw enough of that, but it's not that like it's it happens today in some college campuses, I don't know, in America or in other places that are just really bad. But in some European ones, it happens the same, actually. But at least in my experience, that is now also some year old, back in the day, I saw certain things, but just our own way, our own kind of the local national style, and it wasn't too intense. And albeit, as most Western Europe, you come from countries that had, black and red terrorism up to some decades ago, so it wasn't really anything. We had other fascism or communism so back in the day. So it's like of course history is influenced and the approaches to it are influenced, but they're not even for the worst actually, because as we have discovered over time, you can't really separate history from politics, in the sense that one thing is making political activism, and that is kind of bad, but one thing is stating anything that of course is going to have a political impact whatsoever. That I myself make some political considerations when I talk about history, because I came to the obvious conclusion that you must do that in a sense. Otherwise, how can you explain the world? Right? Is having bias such a bad thing? If it's unfair, I can understand that, but if it is actually substantiated as a narrative by evidence and actual evidence, and you, again, having this broader scope, this broader capacity of comparison, of that turns out to be quite profitable, right? And so that's, by the way, one of the other issues why normally we don't have, we keep having political activism, because I presume that in order to be a political activist in these scientific contexts, you're probably not educated enough, right? There is probably a problem at the root of what you're doing there, what you're thinking like, and it's a problem. And I'm definitely intolerant for these kind of things, because I also tend to, let's say, my biases mostly substantiates in something that goes against what is the prevalent side of the issue, right? It's not that left and right are always bothering and annoying at the same time. There are imbalances, as we know, and so it's important to just concentrate, even just on one of the two, but even if you did it on purpose, right? Because you don't have literally to cover everything, but still it's important to fix an idea if it's wrong, independently from which side it is. The problem is doing it, again, not by trying to make political activism, but to demonstrate that scientifically. Excuse me, I drink a little. So, a manual can easily trick you like that, can easily trick you in a national perspective, can make you believe essentially that your country was kind of the most important thing ever happened in history. But it again, that it's not the problem is not the problem in itself. It's why that could happen. Why could you mature such an idea? And that automatically means, again, that you've not been exposed to information that is taking in adequate consideration a comparative and diachronic perspective. Because at the end of the day, knowing history is about that. I mean, let's be honest, what do we care about history the most? It's like, are you really, I don't know, I say it maybe it can be strange for you to hear it from an actual historian. It's not that I have a specific historical interest. And it's not that I'm thinking all the time about, that guy back in the day in history, that dynasty, that country. I frankly don't give a damn about that. Like, I care about that when of course, I have to make an assessment myself about that, so I care very much about it in that sense, and I go with it. But let's say in my, spare time, I think history, but I use it mostly in a sense of, in an emotional, like I mostly have a visual imagination, things like these, or things that can inspire me, abstractly, not because I really am, let's say, tied to one specific historical. Of course, there are some historical visions and opinions that are very relevant, in my opinion, for the appreciation of universal values and human civilization, which, as you know, is kind of one of my leitmotifs, and that can be gotten only not you would think it's bias. It's not bias. It's something that I discovered, that the more people get exposed to history, the more kind of get to understand. Because again, that wouldn't be a universal value otherwise. So it's actually very easy to spot, as always, not just what kind of political interest people have when they say anything historical, or they express their historical, you know, you know, favorites, let's say. And this can be very banal at the level of, what's your favorite army in history, which is also kind of a dumb question. But let's say in general, if you have any sympathy mostly towards which general, which is at least the one that fascinates you the most, aside sometimes from any, too often unfortunately, from any kind of strategic capacity assessment from the side of the person. You can easily it's like people are open books, right? It can just take to ask you those questions, and you will know everything about what they believe, where they come from. You can even guess their social status, their things like these, right? Literally. And the more you know history, and the more given that people come from history themselves, we can literally picture them in that sense. So of course, this is something that at the beginning you're not really capable of distinguishing in a way, because it seems as if, like, when you're young at that point, it's as if you were trying to sort out the world, as if you were confident that there is something to know that is kind of absolutely valid, that somebody has already sorted out for you. So you automatically feel like you're a pup and you're trying to to catch up with the adults, right? And so you let yourself being fed with this stuff that arrives to you. But it's not really the case. When you age, when you grow older, and you have studied all these things, you come to a realization that adults, most of the times, you included, haven't really kind of a clue or an idea of what history concretely is. I mean, at least in a substantial fashion. And so I guess that the essentials of knowing that's the problem. How can you know the basics of medieval history without a manual in that regard? It's not really easy to do. I remember I told you what I did. I took it's not, you see, a manual already has its own narrative. So you can take literally sometimes these tiny compendiums of names and dates, and little pocket format booklets that you can just browse, and getting quickly and easily the information that you need, right? And I'm not saying it's just learning by heart, but it's kind of mostly at that point. Like, it's obvious that you should have already some kind of idea what history is, which in my case at the time I did, roughly, but it was mostly, I wouldn't say just video game based, but say I had a kind of a broader understanding, but mostly in cultural terms. There's certain chronological, major chronological aspects of history escape me still at some point. I mean, still naturally located in the adequate, at least main scansion of the various medieval periods, let's say, but in the adequate places and so on. But let's say, again, dates and names are really important, and should you learn them by heart? Yes, right. So I'm always posing myself the question, as if I were talking now to somebody who literally has an unknown interest for history that is, is not boosted by, university, by anything that I can relate to, right? Just wanting to have an abstract knowledge of history. And at that point, you understand that, I mean, kind of a knowledge of history for an abstract reason. So, however, as we know, it's all about the motivation. Why are you learning that for? So we can all have the motivation to learn by heart, but it also depends on whom you have to relate this stuff to. Because one thing is doing it to a professor, one thing is doing it to friends, another thing is doing it publicly, another thing is doing it with your, privately. So it's not really, most people that don't pursue really a serious learning of history mostly go by anecdotes, by cliches, by cheap ideas that they can mostly throw there, not really connecting in a general sense. It's easy, right? That's what we do with basically all the other topics that we come across, and then we realize that we have to learn them better if we really want to know anything about them. So I guess those are the bases, right? You should first of all have an idea of medieval Europe in its entirety. That's also fundamental. You cannot study, like, if you presume that history, like that you want to study, that you hate geography and you want to study history, the question is either you fix the problem you have with geography or don't study history. Like, that's the most heartfelt advice that I can give you. If you think that, if you hate geography as hell, don't study history before you have actually begun to love geography. Because a person that doesn't know geography, that's easily one of the first people that we should take voting rights from. And the and you simply history doesn't make any sense without, meaning that, as you know, I'm actually a great antagonist of the proposition of geopolitics as such. There's just politics, right? And geography is just one of the many factors. But let's say, when again we're talking about like the five W's, let's say, at least knowing when and where, right, and whom, hopefully as well, and also what, of course, and why. Well, those are the basic questions, and so you understand that the word there is fundamental. You cannot look, thinking medieval history abstractly, not seeing just even dimensionally by space what it meant to be a certain kingdom, to extend in a certain territory, your political control. I mean, it's just it doesn't make any sense, and it's also an easier way actually to learn history at that point, because if you have already a good geographical knowledge, even names and do not sound obscure references to you in space, right? You kind of have an idea where it is, what kind of character it is. So it's important in general with history to have a broader personal culture. A traveling culture is a very good one, but even if you don't have one, because you can't travel for some reason, I mean, you can just everything is one click away from the internet. Fortunately, I was very lucky to travel, really extensively, even though mostly in some specific countries, and let's say, but I'm still fascinated sometimes, and when it doesn't happen that often, but sometimes, let's say, so when I want to waste time, one of my favorite pastimes is to go on Google Maps, and to start looking at landscapes, lands, passing by, and pictures of the places in random places that nobody else would ever click on, right? But going in depth and seeing what's this place in the world exists. It existed at the time. What it was like, even just seeing it, having an idea of the diversity of the world from a geographical point of view is a very important aspect for locating history in its adequate context, in fact, properly speaking. And so that's important, because when you start studying medieval history, you have, more than in other historical times, kind of the need of properly evidencing multiple players at the same time. Like, you study ancient history, objectively, most of the things you have to learn is Mediterranean locations. Even if you talk about the Greeks in general, it's more like an idea sometimes, right? It's not that the single cities or islands are not important, but maybe you don't need to know what was happening in Britain at the same time. But the same goes for Rome, that at least, Rome at some point takes over almost everything, and so it's just Rome, right? Yes, and you can say, yes, but also there was China, there was Parthia, all this. Yeah, but it's mostly just Rome, right? If you study, and all the sources came from there, by the way. Instead, if you study medieval history, the first thing that strikes you at that point is that even more, because even today in Europe we are many countries, and in a sense that's why we are still so it's so even more relevant to learn medieval history, because of all the connections that we expose every time for that. But let's say it's not much the number of the bigger ones, but let's say the understanding the fragmentarity of the whole system, right? And so having an idea of what all these players were doing at the same time within, domestically, in foreign policy, and so on. And it becomes really a mess, because the first thing objectively that strikes you about the medieval history, at least it was for me, is how messed up it was. I mean, like, you just can't, again, as I was saying before, if you study Roman history, more or less you can learn by, I mean, we know dramatically less, of course, about the ancient world compared to the medieval one, but let's say, still, it's about Rome fighting which people, where, which year, and more or less there is a list, and you can even learn it by heart. Medieval history, it's practically impossible to do anything like that, because yes, you can start to know the major battles and so on, but very often that's a problem, which medieval manuals, by the way, manuals do not give you in the first place. And knowing military history also well in that regard, it's the difficulty of finding compendiums about that, because very often also specialists are just specialists of a single country, single context. So they may actually, in fact, not know anything about, right? If somebody has just studied the Baltic Crusades and just knows about Lithuania, about the Teutonic Order, etc. Maybe, they have never studied the Reconquista, and they legitimately know nothing about that thing. So this may seem bizarre, but it's really not, because also by modern times, contemporary times, states, as we've seen, yes, are many, but ever more compact. So international policy becomes, in a sense, still more complicated, but it's still, at least the points of reference are still, the actors are kind of always those ones, right? Instead, medieval times, it's not really like that. Excuse me, I drink again. So, this dimension, and also the idea that to each of there is a trick, right? The best trick for studying, getting good marks, and all these things is actually learning stuff, right? And it's the easy way to cheat out of the whole thing. And so, if you have difficulties to remember all these various countries, what they were about, you should also try to look at them, their art, their cities, there's even, as seen geography there are so many beautiful pictures on the internet, even about warriors and stuff, that we can't post anymore because of copyright issues and so on. But that we never had, but that they had the moral principle, at least at some point, to understand that it was immoral to use, and so that we can't show anymore. But let's say, also, we have a lot of beautiful images telling the truth. Anyway, it was just my fault. But jokes aside, even that approach to, in fact, the material culture, I mean, knowing what we're talking about in terms, for example, in the Middle Ages, I mean, in terms of art or architecture, those are not just, this is valid for any civilization, but let's say if you look at a Gothic cathedral there, you can see something that, first of all, had never happened before, but secondly, that expresses properly a concept, an ideology, a symbology, a mystics, a universal view, a religion, and way more, in ways that you can still see, because at least if you live, I don't know, in fact, in the same Europe, you can kind of go out and see that, not very far away from wherever you live. So that's really something you can relate to more easily. I never touched the topic of whether, it could be, for example, how difficult it is, but I don't think it's that much, like for somebody who lives outside of Europe to study European history, even we're talking about Westerners, right? What's the Australian experience of, learning medieval European history? Even if those were your ancestors largely by, at least by large. The same goes for United States or whichever country that had a connection whatsoever, independently also from the demographics. Like, how do you connect with that? Those are, to me, obscure fields, in the sense that I'm mostly displeased by how other countries look at each other in general because of their bias. But let's say, I also understand that there are mythologies, ideologies regarding that are not exactly crystalline in terms of historical objectivity, and we can see even strange perceptions about history. I mean, I don't know, you would discover that in India currently Hitler, by a large standard, is a popular figure, right? You don't want to know why that is the case, but it happens. And the question is, um, that tells way more about how history is perceived in general by about that culture, rather than actually finding out the problem of, you know, why for some strange cases this has come to be, which is, I mean, it's truly interesting. But let's say it's like you show Japanese what a swastika is, and they don't know. So these are deep, powerful ideas. If you think about that, that tells you how much the world is factually alienated from historical reality at so many levels. And especially, as we often make the point, like, it's not that the West is really an invention, or something you can simply tear apart, because it's obviously an approximation, right? Approximations still, if they overlap some consistent reality that is way more complex but still somewhat substantial, is a thing. And in my historical experience, I must say, I've grown dramatically ever more Western centric, even though I understand it's not like it's a problem in a sense when you at least try to say that everything depends on that. But it's those kind of things that history forcefully makes to you, especially even when you're just doing it by yourself. This is the magic. Like, it's like, I don't know, understanding the necessity of an empire, or kind of a universal value. Those are not things that, at some point you can, but there are ways and ways to make them, right? So there is no doubt about this. But about the necessity intrinsically, or the fact that we should be having a discussion about that, we don't, and as a negative thing as a result, I think history immediately exposes you to in ways that are extraordinary. And especially, I must say that in the last year or so, I also came to think history in very interesting ways that I never thought before, mostly because of the swing between this relation between the, let's say, the moral effort and the scientific knowledge, and how these things interplay with each other. So it can be lots of things that are a bit in a bit more advanced fashion, but it would be better to acquaint the students to, also from an early age. I mean, for example, I don't know, a great bias towards the Middle Ages is this idea that it was somewhat this is, as a conservative, I must say, that I'm fair, and I'm stern but fair. This is mostly a conservative view, but I mean, okay. Also, the liberals make this point, depending on what they think about that. This was somewhat the century of religion in obscurantism as a consequence, right? Or in sense, from a conservative perspective, of a non-secularized, beautiful non-secularized world. Now, these are two very preposterous propositions. Like, it's the Middle Ages, prorompently, I would say, is something that actually is the surpassing of the secularization within itself. And also, it wasn't actually an obscurantistic era at all, right? And it's also, of course, just I presume insane from a literally mental health point of view to consider that religion as a problem in that context. But again, the Middle Ages is seen as very often as a compact wall, and that idea is exactly one of the first indicators of how much a person doesn't actually know, not gradually, but literally anything about medieval history. And I don't say it because I can't boast of who knows which. Don't think I'm not even that. Don't think that I know medieval history that well. Right? I just came to, maybe it's just due to Schwerpunkt that I cover lots of things, but don't think that, in fact, we come out of our curricula like with this deeply ingrained knowledge of medieval things, right? And so there are people who are, there's another category of people that I loathe deeply, is that those people that study the Middle Ages just because they're obsessed with fantasy. I don't know, Lord of the Rings, or movies in general. All these I just can't take it, right? I completely revolt against that, and I and not for the obvious. It's like, it's just that it's not just like, I don't know, feeling like you feel sick when you look at a pre-Raphaelite painting, or you realize how much, of course, we have completely distorted, in fact, medieval history in the first place, perceptionally, in the West. But the Middle Ages didn't exist, of course. It's just a polemical term invented by the 15th century to denigrate some, times and places at some point. But it's more about, again, the motivation. What does bring people to, like, to be so superficial, to motivate themselves to be medievalists by, just to be obsessed with medievalism in itself, which has nothing to do with the Middle Ages by definition. That's terrifying, and that's, most sadly enough, even among intelligent people that I know, I see that's an illness. That's yet another virus. That's what we haven't managed to tame, and that I really can't see. Like, one of my greatest ambitions as a historian is, of course, to be objective in judgment, in evaluation, and this cannot start from the standpoint that I am, a fun boy of whatever fictional delirium based on a medievalistic delusion can be, right? There is probably intrinsically in these things nothing that is worth historical value, right? And so I don't. I understand maybe from one side that these forces have indirectly contributed to bring people closer to the Middle Ages. That's a positive thing, as for most things historical. But again, I'm increasingly disturbed by the still the consequences that this brings in the process. It's not a pure kind of scientifically driven idea of wanting to sort out things for what they were, not to trick your mind. It's just like a fashion, right? And this often happens also at levels of very high levels. You find even professors that are like that, and that's when you probably start dissociating with the idea that there is an intrinsic value within the being just part of that. That's a bit more advanced consideration. Let's say I don't know. It's maybe because I've never been fascinated by any kind of follower, but let's say by any kind of leader, any kind of follower instinct, or this sense of a myth, a model that I have to reach. Never had this, right? There are authors that I like and appreciate, but my attitude is forever critical. Like, I can't never be content with just one thing, because nobody can provide you with that. Instead, most people cheer just the stereotype, the caricature, even the narcissism, actually, and the mythomania sometimes. And that's a problem, increasing problem in our culture. Let's say who they are, where they're not, or whatever they do. It can be painful at times. In any case, the main issue of this whole thing is based on the realization that you have to learn in ways, in fact, that are somewhat autonomous. You see, even if you presume that that first medieval history exam is relatively easy and you have at least to know a few things, but especially in a subject like medieval history, right? You're brought, like, by curiosity, because of these enormous multitude of references to sovereign, to kingdoms, to realities, to dynasties, popes, emperors, all these things. That see, what was this thing really about, right? Was this? And so, as I was saying before, medieval history is quite peculiar, and at least we like to think, as medievalists, that we are the only true historians that exist, or that at least we are the most human type of historian, because we are exposed constantly to a real mess, to a real fix that you have to sort out all the time, in ways that it's incredibly superficial to generalize in when it comes to other eras, right? medieval manuals usually much more circumstantiated. Let's say historiography has pointed out how, very well all the difficulties that revolve around trying to reconstruct the Middle Ages in a in a solid way. Let's say maybe they haven't stressed properly what this means in practice in order to fix the problem, because again, the problem hyper specialization is also a problem, in fact, among medievalists. But say, as before, paradoxically, medieval history the medieval historian can bond much more easily with a contemporary historian, exactly because of the fluidification sometimes of the subtle dimension of this idea of returning to pre-Westphalian systems, which is also, it's a bit an illusion, but approximately it can be a category of a pattern interpretation. Whereas when you consider history mostly with some macro blocks that mostly are easily to character, you automatically assume that, in fact, that reconstruction is less controversial than you should be for you to express too much. And also, well, there are increasing problems. Say, the more you go on, you can see this also in medieval history, that the more sources you have. So it's obvious also that a modernist, but even just a late medievalist, starts seeing a big deal of problems in trying to sort out kind of the comprehensive dimension of his own period at that point. So even less contemporary history, which is like an infinite space where basically even in there you can't even, I'm serious when you say you can't even properly call them historians, because sometimes they're just doing something else, right? They're not even properly studying what you would think at the main sociological interest, let's say politological or even military historical one of the situation. Is maybe they're just something closer to journalists sometimes, or to archivists. I mean, it depends, of course, where this can happen with everybody, with medievalists, let's say. But aside from this last two, especially the archivist, let's say you get an idea of how bad it can be, how also intertwined with other subject, like even philosophy, right? It's much easier for, I don't know, a contemporary historian to be a bit also interested in philosophy, not even properly in history or philosophy strictly meant, than, let's say, when a medievalist is, if he studies philosophy, it's because properly he studies that specific philosophy that existed in the Middle Ages at some point. So it's something very, and it's still history of philosophy. So things can vary wildly. So to get that comprehensive view, the best thing is always to search for more, to find explanations, to have an idea of how is it possible that this power was this at this time, why it had happened, why it had lasted, why it was taken out. These are all the questions that that you should be able to answer mechanically. It's not just a remembering more or less the broader topic, or even in a war won or lost just for itself. Let's say why that happened, right? What is that brought to, I don't know, even for that war to take place, and why that side, why that outcome. This can become complex. Maybe, in an examination, in that context, you wouldn't get that question. Maybe, say, in a deeper sense. But let's say, if you want to learn medieval history, well, basically, you should be able already to reason like that. And actually, I think it's unavoidable. And that makes the difference between the good student and bad student, the one that just is there for learning, real learning stuff, and the other just for passing, to get that degree for whatever reason that has nothing to do with history at the end of the day. So that is the recompositive thing, but still with a skeleton, still with a pattern, with an order, right? So with a reference to times, places, so that you can more easily say, okay, well, this information here pertain to this context, this to the other, and only gradually you can start really understanding something deeper, right? I doubt that certain dynastical, because most of the Middle Ages, given that there were no real modern states as we intend them at least, uh, revolved around even very often dynastic questions that are extremely complicated. And so that you may not, I don't know, what about the Piast's marriage policy was about, which is that's normally, I don't know, if you're Polish, probably you would be more into it, but in general, it's something not even, in manuals you don't even know. If we're talking about the Hohenstaufen, and if we're talking about France, England, those things start normally to be a bit more appreciated. But just for the sake of, knowing more or less what we're talking about, and sometimes not understanding by which margin things could have easily gone in another direction, right? So this last aspect is also relevant. Like, how do you properly appreciate what, it's always a temptation, let's put it in this way, at the beginning when you have to make sense of the world, to draw deterministic lines, to say, well, this happened because of this, and this happened because of that. Yes, it kind of happened because of this and because of that, but still, this and that could have been, at that point, completely changed by other factors, apparently also relevant ones, that if you don't take in adequate consideration, you may, lose, in fact, and appreciate the effort that this system's made, because medieval history is a great effort, in fact, to make things work without a state, and so creating a state out of scratch, in a sense, and so making an effort that we kind of give, say, for the relative stability of our political and social systems. It's something we give for granted. Everything has always worked. There's always been this system that provided us with what we need. At the time, it wasn't quite the same. Of course, they would think that the situation was much less was much less unstable, and it was a much simpler world. After all, it was just a bunch of rich guys, and basically all the other people working the land, approximately, which is also maybe not the best way to see the Middle Ages, because also this normally fuels some kind of strange political interpretations. But in fact, understanding that was the case, and the effort that those guys made in order to put things together, to make things work better and to improve, and considering that those systems still improve the world, the general quality of life, and that humans seem to be able to do it pretty well in spite of all, at least if you look at it from a longer perspective, perspective, you can easily see that there was a positive outcome that, in this sense, again, should be appreciated, because what you would see sometimes as a condition of anarchy wasn't anarchic at all, right? In fact, as we were saying before, for a modernist or even a contemporaries at that point, it's very difficult to explain how things could work if there was not a state, or at least the type of state that we have been told to be only kind of the modern standard thing. And before I've met modernists myself that denied the existence of centralization in anything that wasn't before that was before the modern age. I guess that, yes, you can stress maybe the term accentration, but which also I don't even know whether it exists in English. But let's say the idea of centralization, even a tribe is centralized by some degree, right? There is always somebody that puts things in common, at least under a form of organization that somebody takes care of in a centralized system. So sometimes the stubbornness, even of people who should be supposed to be experts and actually are not, is unbelievable on an ideological ground, right? But if you descend in the details of, let's say, think about, I don't know, we talk often about that the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, and that is normally like the way we are told at school normally is a bit like the Roman Empire. Some evil barbarian arrived and crushed it, right? So people believe actually that things like, I don't know, the Normans, the Magyars, or the Saracens were the active and decisive cause of why the Carolingian Empire was torn apart, was disgregated. They don't see that were mostly just a a consequence of an internal collapse that normally you wouldn't consider if you don't consider in fact what is the political and social balance of those realities, which if you reason in a kind of modernistic nationalistic sense you can see, because we still after all show history with this show historical maps with this kind of homogeneous colors and distinct board boundaries, etc. And of course it doesn't even take to be a medievalist to understand that it's not quite the case in reality, even quite maybe even in contemporary times. And so when you see the collapse, you say, okay, so the state, which in some senses didn't even exist, especially if you look at such a privatized system like the Carolingian one, collapse, so it had to be a freaking mess. Well, overall, yes, it was a freaking mess, but what we point there is not chaos, it's not anarchy. Because if you go deeper, say on a smaller scale, you analyze, as it's been done historiographically, the behavior of this and that lord locally. But this system, first of all, was hierarchical, of course, but secondly, was trying to actually stabilize the system. Even this is what is somewhat difficult for us to understand. It also, the hierarchy competition is basically the best way to create civilization. Actually, and arguably, there is no other way, right? So, this myth we've been fed also that the state pre-exists in a sense as or at least exists as a normal condition just of civilized cultures, right? Culturalism would tell you that the barbarian is just an imbecile who wants to kill people because he's a psychopath, and this is, in fact, moral relativism, racism, and the worst you can imagine. You don't understand why it was like that. Right, it may be that the barbarian was literally a psychopath. We have studied fundamentally what the war bands were about, but they were in the sense that you have to appreciate the effort to centralize at that level, where there was basically no other authority existing there, and still managing to score some success, like fundamentally substituting themselves often as elites in also more civilized places. So things are built, and the process of state building, or also of collapse of the state, for that matter. There are many examples. We can see it with the Caliphate of Cordoba, the Byzantine Empire. We can see even, by the mid-14th century, there are some collapses of universal powers. They're a bit something different from states, but let's say there are some mechanisms of that kind. Is also very relevant. Excuse me, drink a little. In the sense that we underestimate the power of a state. Right, understanding that after, how, of course, the collapse of a strong power brings to disruption, to privatization, to a dysfunctional development that eventually has to be recomposed in a subtle sense afterwards, is fundamental, and it goes up and down. Like after 1204, what was the Byzantine Empire de facto collapsed as the state that had existed since Roman times. Right, what we'll see later is something very different, because in the meanwhile most of the system had been taken over, privatized, feudalized, and so it's not always the same thing. And so even that political thermometer is very important. Who reasons nationalistically in these contexts mostly doesn't care, mostly sees history like the epopee of a single people, as if there was even such a thing like one, and the, let's say, the kind of unchangeable nature of this cultural quality of whatever they think it like, and they don't face the construction of that same national identity, which I think is very important, right? You can appreciate a nation without being an ethno-nationalist or a nationalist just in the first place, right? That's pretty dumb. It's the difference that passes, in fact, between the Middle Ages and medievalism in the same way, and Aka not understanding anything basically about what a nation is if you're a nationalist. So these are things, again, that if you come from a very heavily biased political background, it takes very often a lot of time to understand. Not much because you're from that political side, but because you have basically no education, no moral system, no developed moral system, at least, and it's very hard to build something that for decades in your life has never been built. And this is one of the greatest problems that we face in general with the majority of the population, I would say. So never underestimate in that sense what it means to have a prolonged historical intensive historical education, because that literally and gradually exposes you in depth to these kind of problems. So you literally understand how countries, peoples, and entities were made, right? Not in a abstract ideal sense, but quite concretely so. In fact, there can be a debate that, in fact, not, as I was just saying, it's not all the time that you bring up the concept of nation, you're actually making a nationalistic point. It can be a, it can be a risk, because, every ism is still, can still be found in the excess of a certain key of interpretation, let's say, but at the same time, for the same reason, you must approximate by a certain degree. So the idea of state making, the idea, especially in the Middle Ages, that of course were, the interest towards which was revived in the 19th century exactly because of this romantic idea of the birth of nations and so on, periods of peoples and so on, is actually true, right? It's actually true in some ways, and so it's important again to understand how certain countries came to be and their differences. By the way, another thing that is often done by moral relativists when looking at medieval history, again, very often, from a perspective of, it's not even left or right. I find many leftists make this point as well, because they are kind of, hidden nationalists sometimes, even if, whether they don't want to admit that, is that, they can't accept that their country, for example, was, I don't know, less developed than another. And pointing that out seems bad, but if you kind of don't understand, like even today, like if you go around the world, you don't really know the differences in terms of GDP, debt, deficit, per capita wealth, all these things. Like, how can you average wage, all these things, how average salary, let's say, how can you understand the world? Like, what sense does it make exactly to engage in any kind of broader political historical consideration? Like, it means by definition that you don't know anything about that. And if you're trying to reconstruct the past, or as much as the present, which is still past anyway, like, how can you avoid to judge and to have a bias in that regard? This is very important, because I realize that sometimes I make points that sound kind of merciless, but they also come from a very concrete historical, understanding. I suppose, like, if you look at certain indicators, like, they can't, it's kind of obvious that certain realities were in a way or another. They are also very strongly established historiographical, macroscopical topics. Like, they're not just personal interpretations of medieval history. Even in that sense, those lamentations mostly do reflect the lack of an objective knowledge, but of knowledge whatsoever. Because again, the more you're provided with knowledge that is accurately depicting reality, you become objective immediately, because there is no other way through that, right? So again, most of the times that those points are made is because, again, you already know that by default, you know what the reasons behind those issues are, what a person is getting to, and fundamentally you can also properly attribute to that opinion the value that rather than having it really doesn't have. But this is kind of obvious still today, and people sometimes feel so rooted to that kind of identities that do not accept, right? And maybe they prefer to buy into other ideologies rather than having an objective, accurate depiction of their own realities. This happens all the freaking time. It still happens today. Right? That it's easier to turn your head, or just saying, I want to be out of it, not to actually picture reality for the way it is, right? And so these are also very common issues, because they don't belong to one country or another. They actually belong to every country, because every country has problems. The only difference at that point, which is an accurate statement. Now, the only difference at that point is whether you engage into moral relativism and you say that, therefore it all depends on how you see it, which is an anti-scientific principle, or you try, in fact, to make a scientific assessment and say, and trying to find those objective parameters that kind of describe better that situation. So it is very that's the difference between those who work and those like who don't at the end of the day. Normally I think that that's how easily you understand the thing gets political, because especially if you have to make this kind of assessments today, and still today is the past and influenced by also the far past, it's obvious that you have to cope with real people that eventually also have historical but also political opinions and act as such. And so that's the dimension in which history becomes political, because you're not really making, again, activism because you have a terrible bias that you want to enforce on others. It's because you're actually showing people presenting people with evidence, and there is normally a level of cognitive dissonance for which they insist too much, they don't want to agree. So that's also a very useful way to test the person's kind of openness and kind of capacity, in fact, to absorb information, to be fair. And this is very important for a historian. You should aim at that, even when you are very, very, let's say at the beginning of that journey. Other tricks about learning medieval history, I don't know. I can't tell you I remember specifically what can happen. Of course, some issues are mostly based on how you learn things. So I made videos on how to prepare an exam, or studying, learning all these things. I had my method, but which I also presume is not necessarily the only one, but at least something that is obviously functional in a way. You just have to sum up, the whole system, maybe with really a text written on your own in smaller form, remembering the most important things and repeating over and over, talking, speaking up, because when you're examined, like, you may even have something in mind, but not having been able to articulate that along the way. So, and integrating into this text some extra information, or other information that you look back at the book and said, wait a second, I didn't understand how that happened. So you go back seeing that again. So that's a way. But specifically for learning medieval history, it's a bit too hard. I made to specify, at least, we could do it, but it would require more time. But I have made videos about this all. For example, the difference that exists between studying early and low Middle Ages. There are different periods, there are different times. But still, normally this applies for a more advanced to a more advanced learning stage, when you have to cope with sources mostly. Of course, it's important in this sense maybe to picture adequately the, let's say, the concreteness of dominations. I mean, appreciating how materially poor, for example, the early Middle Ages were, and how rich the low ones were, in a way. To understand the big crack of the mid-14th century that I always talk to you about, and so the consequences that arrive still, the modern age, or even the contemporary one, in terms of levels of population in Europe and so on. Properly also the idea, in fact, that before that there is this big medieval civilization that I call it often like this, to stress, in fact, properly the scale of the boom, because we don't know between, in fact, the 10th to 13th century, even, we're talking, yes, about tens of millions of people, but sometimes it's difficult, if not impossible, properly to be more precise. And this was enormous, and it contracted at some point. So that expressed also, that came also with an idea of the world, with a confidence, with a vision of the universe, of God, of what politics should be about accordingly. So it's very important to understand the mindset. You can attach these ideologies, why they were born, but of course they were born after the early Middle Ages, because in fact the system was more complex, and so it required more developed hierarchies and ideologies to govern, to regulate, and to grow properly. To understand even here the enormous effort that the ruling classes made in order to fix problems. How you absolutely shouldn't see the Middle Ages like a moment where, you can simply see, I don't know, in somebody just because it's of lower status that, you automatically sympathize because, you come from a democratic context. It didn't work like that at the time. Those people were not really democratic in the way we intend, nor they had less ferocious or repressive or intolerant views compared to the elite. So it really depends, right? And largely today it's still kind of the same, even though by different degree. So also understanding, for example, why the scale of certain, this can be useful. I mean, nobody will probably ask you, but at least as a military historian, it's important to say these things and say, why, I don't know, early medieval dominations were apparently larger in scale, right? You had these big chunks after all. You had the Franks, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, right? More or less, that's it in the West. And so you would assume something larger means it's more powerful, right? Instead they say below Middle Ages, it's all, I don't know, Germany had 300 states, Italy 30, things like these. It's all more fragmented, right? And also the other kingdoms had all the duchies, the principalities weren't quite the same thing. It's actually, so they were weaker. That's actually the other way around. I mean, if we're talking about weaker in terms of individual wealth, power, capacity, absolutely not. It's completely different. If you're talking, of course, in absolute terms, but if you measure it by territorial extension, in relative terms to those early medieval realities, well, yes, but why should you measure it just by territorial extension? Judge it by civilizational output, right? There were, states that didn't even have a monarchy. Pick Italy, that they created humanism and the Renaissance out of scratch, like things like these. Equally, some more centralized monarchic systems were definitely less vivacious, but also were more military powerful. So, in fact, the idea of knowing how to read maps is also very important. Don't read maps just, you see all one color. You think, I don't know, the Kievan Rus, it's all blue. So it means that was all one big state, right? Oh, look at how big. No, there were basically 10 different principalities that had barely any kind of cohesion between each other. You see the Holy Roman Empire, you see this big black, stain all over Central Europe, Italy, and so on. They say, wow, so that was a real state, right? No, it wasn't. As I was saying before, there were like, hundreds of different states. And in this sense, also the quality of the state sometimes was much higher in relative terms compared to the one of, much absolutely larger power. Like, I don't know, pick the Spanish monarchies, the French one, the English one, and so on. So every system was different, by the way. So you can't really even make that equation just by, but kind of generally speaking, by scale, approximately, that seemed to be the case. So it's incredibly important to stress this and to appreciate those internal dynamics, because otherwise you wouldn't properly understand why even a political fragmentation could make some of the most important things. I mean, as I was saying before, by the end of the Middle Ages, the most technologically advanced countries were Germany and Italy. They were the most fragmented of all Europe, right? Not necessarily the weakest per se, right? Pick, I don't know, still the Scandinavian marks, them. They took their own time before becoming something functional, up to basically the modern age. And whereas other systems were somewhat already more thriving. And also, there is an important picture that, in fact, mostly North-centric manuals, mostly the ones that come from the Anglosphere, normally ignore. That is to say that, there's a bit mixing the cards there, and not realizing comprehensively that, Southern Europe still basically remain the richest, most populated, more advanced, also technologically speaking, thing basically throughout all the Middle Ages, proportionally compared to Northern Europe. But Northern Europe rose in proportion to Southern Europe, the Middle Ages, more quickly, right, in relative terms. but that still there is this dramatic civilizational output that very far from having disappeared together with the Roman Empire, which is yet another enormous mistake it is done, is continuously emanated mostly from in the West from Rome, but you can easily see Constantinople, I don't know, with the Slavs and so on, that kept sending inputs that helped to organize, to evangelize, to administrate, to create territorial power. So it was something very big, culturally speaking. That's yet another thing that is mostly not really appreciated. Like, to make an example, like English historiography, that of course we owe a lot of things to, thankfully, positively. Also, however, left some bias in general towards the way we still popular culture sees the Middle Ages, because of course the British Empire informed the world. Still, essentially, the Americans derive culturally from that mold, and not just them, all the Commonwealth countries and so on. And so that is a big deal, because if this had if the French had won the 7 Years' War, today we would have a completely different idea of the Middle Ages, for example. Equally, if other powers kind of prevailed at some point historically, and I don't know, it's typical, for example, from a British perspective, to stress, because it's obvious, for example, that the early Middle Ages in general were much worse than in most other areas of Europe, because Britain was dramatically underdocumented at the time. Basically, the Romano-Britons, we don't even know what happened there. And eventually, it was a country that had been, relatively less Romanized than the others. It was, it had a greater decadence of the cities, for example. So there is all this idea also that the Anglo-Saxon migrations were something more clumsy, less articulated. Think about the Heptarchy, and actually the much more the tens of different kingdoms were established initially. I mean, if you pick, I don't know, in the meanwhile, Ostrogothic Italy, or Merovingian Francia, or Visigothic Spain, I mean, those were completely something else in terms, properly, levels of centralization, of population, of literacy, or there was something enormous. And so, where did the bias of the Dark Ages stem from? It's an old one, right? It's not that it was invented by, I don't know, British historiography. It was created, in fact, by the same, it was actually created by the same Italians back in the day, because the humanists came from there. So it's paradoxical, because, of course, the Italians looked at Rome and said, look, we were there before, now we're there, so whatever happened in between sucked, right? But in a greater historiographical perspective, let's say that other countries reevaluated much more the importance of early medieval times as opposed to Britain, where paradigmatically that's a different situation. Britain also, let's say, presented us with this idea of, for example, of a Viking era. Now, yes, historiographically, here and there are countries, or historians that attribute the term era to a phase that can be more or less circumscribed in times and space. But why would the Vikings would give an origin to an era conceptually, and there is not something like a Saracen era or a Magyar era, right? That's obviously because it was kind of British centric as a concept. And so there are many considerations. I mean, even the same idea we have of the Vikings today, it stemmed from a very important kind of vision that in the Victorian age was thought of the Vikings, and so this terrible thing. And then eventually, for ethno-nationalistic reasons, now we go to the other excess. So these people were, somewhat the most beautiful thing that happened on Earth. That were so brave and advanced and so beautiful and so on. But even if you look at it from a Scandinavian perspective, well, yes, let's say, admittedly, for Scandinavians, history begins with the Vikings, right? So that, even think about that. The different countries in Europe have different times in which their history begins. I mean, it's obvious that for a Greek, history begins basically earlier than any other European, conceptually, in the idea that was the founding moment of glory and whatever. For a Scandinavian, that happens 1 millennium later, and we're talking still about Europe in that sense. Well, even in a Scandinavian perspective, I mean, the Viking era is definitely not the most important thing that happened to Scandinavia. I mean, arguably, there are things that, the Viking era surely opened to some spaces and contexts that helped to develop Scandinavia. But let's say, even just in a political institutional sense, Scandinavians are kind of, proud of part of, I think of their monarchies in general, and the idea so that these were created in the Middle Ages, that yes, some of them factually stemmed, in fact, from the Viking era, but that still they became also more powerful later. So, what do mostly people in popular culture know about medieval Scandinavia aside from the Viking era? There is an awful lot to know about Scandinavian history besides the Viking era. But there is also this idea of warriorism, of internationalism, the idea that the Vikings embody some kind of super power and purity and whatever. So it's a broader bias that bought into in a broader popular sense. But still, the idea of the Viking era, again, if it had been, again, if we had had a French Empire triumphant in the 7 Years' War, we would see the Viking era in a much different way. Because for France, the Vikings were, let's say, less important than for Britain, historically speaking, and that's understandable. It's also a bit the same idea of the Middle Ages that, altogether, stereotypically, we have in mind. It's basically a copy of 15th century England, right? It's the typical kind of, house structure, colors, even weather, if you imagine that, that you would be surprised by how impacting that is. Right, most TV shows, etc. That mostly, if you think Middle Ages, that's it, right? That's the point of the model of reference. It's not 13th century Bulgaria. It's not 8th century France. It's something else, right? So it's very important, in my opinion, to observe this, because at the end of the day, when you're forming yourself, you should be able to pose yourself questions. But is this judgment kind of based on what? Like objectively, like why did this author decide to write this thing about manuals? I personally love very old manuals. I love the ones that still were very much comprehensive, were evenemential based, that also made some broader consideration, appreciation of these deeper structural things, right? Even as you know, I'm not actually a structuralist, but at that point, like as a continental European, you're almost obliged to be at that point, considering by political influence in universities. But let's say it may be useful, effectively, as we were saying before, for somebody who has to get the fundamentals right, to have at least approximately the idea that there is a structure, pattern, interpretation, so not to overcomplicate your ideas in the process too much. And there are arguably many other considerations that one could make, and all things you should be careful about. And as I was saying, the important thing is for you to actually get the right, as many information as possible in the meanwhile, and try to memorize them, because at that age, you're able to do it. You're able to fix if you don't do it at that age, it should be kind of the same. But of course, the younger you are, the more your advantage in this regard. And so, let's say getting the essentials right means that you have to make that effort at that point, and then you will live of rent for the rest of your life, in part. Really, and it's crucial what kind of education you get in those years, and what kind of I'm mostly critical, of course, of whatever I had the opportunity to learn at university, but objectively, yes, I also appreciate that maybe by academic tradition, it was influenced nationally also by this idea that, should have really also much more quantitative and concrete amount of information, rather than just, a broader interpretation of a concept of what the Middle Ages were. Because with the Middle Ages, you can't really approximate too much, right? And so, yes, getting the fundamentals right is important, again, as just said, so you can also make some kind of approximation. I even made a video that says what did kind of the Middle Ages have in common. Yes, it was in this sense. You shouldn't even be fooled by the complexity of a political map or the fragmentation, etc. There weren't substantial differences. Like Europe was more or less all the same in terms of material culture, type of institutions, and so on. So yes, that's important to get as fundamentally, but still, for what you will eventually come to know, hopefully over time, it's better since the beginning to stress instead. I mean, to know the actual references, to know the actual details, the actual powers, and what they were, what they did. That's fundamental in my opinion. In a sense, that's what I learned medieval history for. Right? I can say I love history in general. It's not that I love particularly the Middle Ages, for that matter. It may be surprising to you. Because again, I don't make it an identitaristic issue, right? I came to study. It happened to me to study this thing, and I I had to learn it well, and I was glad to do it. But because it's history in general, not because it is the Middle Ages. Right? It's because you want to know factually what happened, how it worked, and having a substantial base. And if really kids today were endowed since the first year of university with that kind of sound, evaluation capacity, with all the limits of the situation, of course. Well, we would have much better historians, much better medievalists specifically, but this is valid also for basically all the other, in other ways also for the rest of, for the other eras, as we've seen. But yeah, if you're interested, I can keep making these videos. For now, however, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.